Well, good morning. As you know, City Council and the Toronto Police Services Board have begun intensive work to respond to the very real concerns raised about anti-black racism in our city and to bring about real, tangible reforms to policing and in other areas. When we initiated North America's first anti-black racism unit in our city's government, I stood as mayor and acknowledged that despite our city being one of the world's most admired for its foundational values and way of life, systemic racism continues to be a real issue here in Toronto, and there is much more all of us can and must do to confront it and to eliminate it. We began work on this at that time, a couple of years ago, but the people have clearly told us that we haven't acted enough or fast enough, and that is a message we have heard loud and clear. So Council introduced a lengthy list of reforms at our meeting held in June, and the Police Services Board undertook a number of community consultations to hear directly from residents. Those consultations have helped lead to the next significant policing reforms report, which is being released publicly today and goes to the Police Services Board for consideration next week. This policing reforms report represents the board's holistic response to calls for meaningful police reform in the city and should be seen as a complement to the landmark reforms initiated by the City Council in June of 2020, this past June. The policing reform report builds on the changes proposed by the board in June, concrete steps towards reform, including producing a line-by-line budget for the public to review. I believe this report shows we are listening to City Council, we are listening to the public, the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-black racism, and the board's advisory panels on racism and on mental health. This report contains over 80 recommendations divided into 10 themes. 1. Alternative community safety response models, in other words, different people other than police answering calls in different ways than is presently the case. Secondly, police budget and budgetary transparency. Thirdly, independent auditing and service accountability. Fourthly, selection criteria for a new police chief. Fifthly, data sharing and information transparency. Sixth, conduct accountability, in other words, more accountability for misconduct by police officers. 7, police training. 8, consultation with experts and communities on an ongoing basis. 9, building public confidence. And 10, ensuring change. And while there are many, many reforms outlined in the report itself, the most significant reforms proposed by the report would be the following. First, working with the service, the police service, and the city manager on non-police alternatives for community safety, including but not limited to mobile mental health and addictions crises, and identifying funding that can potentially be reallocated from the police services budget to supporting alternate community safety models. This is something we heard a lot about in the town halls held by the Police Services Board over a period of 4 days earlier in the summer. Secondly, directing the Chief of Police to create a plan to immediately expand the Mobile Crisis Intervention Team with a view to providing MCIT services 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and across all of the divisions, meaning right across the city. At present, those Mobile Crisis Intervention Teams for people in crisis are available only limited hours of the day, on limited days of the week, in limited places across the city. Any funding for this expanded MCIT Mobile Crisis Intervention Team service would come from within the service's 2020 budget, no new money allocated for that, and would be continued to be funded without a request from the service for additional funding for the 2021 budget. While this could represent a long-term alternative, it is more likely an interim measure while work is done on a response and support model for people in crisis which operates outside of the police service. The next recommendation that I would draw attention to is working with the City of Toronto's Auditor General to perform audits of the service now to improve service delivery, identify areas for improvement, and find potential areas for savings and redistribution of funding. Next would be to urge the province to support Council's request for changes to provincial law to expand the instances where officers can be suspended without pay. For example, in cases where there are allegations of serious misconduct. Right now, the ability on the service to deal with these things is seriously restricted by provincial legislation. The next recommendation is advocating to the province that they review the current use of force model, ensuring that a new model is focused on de-escalation and minimizing the use of force, and renaming the use of force model to the de-escalation model. Again, this is something that is mandated by provincial legislation, and we will be advocating to them, if the board approves this report, to make some changes there. Next would be the making permanent of the current anti-black racism training and directing the chief to create a permanent, mandatory, standalone training course with a view to supporting the provision of fair and unbiased policing, which must include components in anti-racism, anti-black and anti-Indigenous racism, interactions with racialized LGBTQ+ and marginalized communities, and human rights accommodations and disabilities. The Policing Reforms Report also recommends that the board create an online monitoring tool to track the progress of the implementation of the reforms, to be available by this October and updated, of course, regularly, and that there be a report in October made available to the board on the status of implementing previous recommendations aimed at the Toronto Police Service, such as those made in the Yakabuchi report, the Loku inquest, and the Way Forward, which is the modernization report written a couple of years ago. This is an ambitious series of reforms, which has the support of the board chair, the board's executive director, and the interim chief of police, as well as positive feedback that we have received from the members of our advisory panels on mental health and on anti-black racism, which committees have been very closely consulted in the course of preparing this report for the board. I want to add my personal support for these proposed reforms and for the discussion of these proposed reforms with people at the Police Services Board next week, including members of the public. I want to add my personal support both as a member of the Police Services Board and as the Mayor of the City of Toronto. These proposed reforms are entirely consistent and complementary to the reforms approved by the vast majority of the City Council at its meeting in June. And the bottom line is these represent serious reforms that we are proceeding with and that we're doing it, as you can see, I hope, with dispatch. And that's because we know the time for reform is now, and that this report will ensure that the reform process begins for real, that we actually begin to implement a number of these things in coming weeks as opposed to even months and years, and that we clearly communicate to the public as the reform is actually happening. This is a recognition of the fact that we know we must do more, because systemic racism in policing threatens the equal rights and opportunity and justice and well-being of Indigenous, Black and marginalized communities in our city. And that is not something that is acceptable to me as Mayor or to you, the people of Toronto. And because it is corrosive, this kind of racism and this kind of marginalization and discrimination of all kinds in all places, it goes directly against those foundational values that we hold dear as Torontonians, but that the world admires as well as they look at us from afar. This continuing racism leaves communities disengaged and alienated and disadvantaged in many ways from services and opportunities in their neighborhoods and in the city as a whole. It leaves people treated fundamentally differently from one another with no other apparent explanation, as we saw from some of these stark numbers contained in the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal interim report released yesterday. We want a police service that works for everyone. They have a very difficult job to do, but we need to have a police service that works for everyone, that's good for all of our communities, that's good for the well-being of all of our residents, and that will be good for the police as well, because it will rebuild the trust that is so fundamental to the effective, safe, and fair carrying out of their important duties. I am committed to lending support to all Toronto residents, wherever they live in our city, and that is why we have invested and will continue to invest millions in poverty reduction and in kids and families to address the root causes of violence and work together with the other governments to do even more. And working together with those other governments is a crucial component of being able to move forward on those continuing and increased investments. I am determined to see that these kinds of measures and all of these different investments we will continue to make and to expand bring about real change starting now and continuing as we move forward. As I have said many times, sensible, meaningful policing change must happen and will happen through the work that the board is doing, the work the interim chief is doing, and the work that the City Council and myself as mayor are doing. This report, to be considered at the police board next week, represents both the beginning of an agenda of real change and a defining moment, defined in this case as it should be by the people of the City of Toronto. The people are watching, as they should be, and so too, I believe the world is watching, because Toronto represents for many people a beacon of hope in these kinds of areas. The world has expectations of Toronto, and while we have to bring about these changes because they are the right thing to do for our own people here, we have to uphold and keep real the values which we cherish and which make this one of the best places in the world in which to live. I look forward to next week's board meeting and to public participation in that board meeting and to a positive response, I hope, from the public and from the board. And I look forward to constructive, collaborative work with the community and with the police service to make sure that we get this done and to make sure that we get it done right. I'm now happy to take your questions moderated by Lavin.
Thank you, Mayor Tory, and thank you for joining us today. We will now open the floor to questions. As a reminder, it's one question, one follow-up. First, we have Lauren Pelly from CBC. Go ahead, Lauren.
Mayor Tory, I just want to shift gears to COVID-19 for a moment. Winter is not that far off in Toronto. Just wondering if this is something that city officials are actively planning for right now, whether that's for winter recreational activities or ways to protect some of the city's vulnerably housed residents.
The answer is yes. This is something that I asked that we begin a month or so ago, and we've traditionally been planning for winter in the month of July at the latest, and we will be looking at all of those areas that have been affected by COVID, ranging all the way from, of course, probably the most acute and important to us in terms of protecting people, which is housing and protection for vulnerable communities, but stretching through as well to the impact that some continuation of a pandemic situation, albeit that we're at stage 3, would have on things like recreation. So the answer to your question is yes, we're actively planning in that regard, and obviously as soon as we have details to offer, we will make them public.
That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Matt Bingley from Global. Go ahead, Matt.
Hi, good morning. Mayor Tory, you are meeting with the Premier this afternoon. There are at least a couple provisions in that report that will rely on the province to comply with and participate. Have you received any sort of commitment from the Premier that you could actually see that participation?
I've talked with both the Premier and with the Solicitor General about these matters because I've written to them outlining some of the changes that were really at their doorstep with respect to some policing reforms. And all I can say to you is that they have expressed a complete willingness to have a sit down and talk about these things in a serious manner. Obviously when I have these chance encounters with them, or even letter writing is not the best way to discuss things that we need to have happen. And so I think when it comes to some of these kinds of things like, how to deal with conduct issues and how to deal with different things that are presently provided for under the provincial legislation, that I hope they'll be open to either looking at solutions that apply to Toronto alone, as they've done through the creation of the City of Toronto Act, or looking at province-wide changes, some of which have been recommended previously under other governments, because I think these things will be positive steps forward. I know that the Premier and the Solicitor General are not oblivious to the messages that we've received from the people, loud and clear with respect to some of the changes they would like to see made.
And just as a follow-up, following the revelations out of the report yesterday, there have been several people within the Black community that have noted that what is in all of these reports is known, and that they're often getting tired of seeing report after report with no change. How can you assure that what is in this one will actually lead to the change that you're detailing?
I think the best evidence people have of the fact that this report, will see real action and real change is the resolution passed by an overwhelming majority that I moved at the City Council meeting in June, and this report being put in front of the Police Services Board next week. These represent probably the most sweeping series of proposed changes to policing, and I think in a way that can be done such that it keeps the members of the police service positively motivated as they go about doing their job, but doing it in a very changed manner, and in fact having some of the responsibilities presently undertaken by police done by others who are better equipped to do that. And I think people will begin to see that real change happen right away. And I think in the past, they've often seen these reports come and then 6 months go by, and by the time the 6 months have passed by and somebody thinks about initiating change, people have almost forgotten about the report. I think in this case, they are seeing City Council move, they are seeing the police board move, they are seeing some of these things that will actually happen in the coming weeks and months, not years, and I think that will be indicative of the fact that we're going to change things, and we're going to change them right, and we're going to change them as quickly as possible, but still do it responsibly.
Okay, and last we have Francine from the Toronto Star. Go ahead, Francine.
Mayor Tory, in terms of a lot of these recommendations that are made in Appendix A, they don't have a set time frame, like there's no kind of deadline date. Is that an issue, do you think? I mean, should there be more deadlines written into the text of these recommendations?
I didn't count, Francine, but I read all of the reports that were written, and I will say that I was impressed at just how many of them did have deadlines and how soon some of those deadlines were. If you look at the amount of work, for example, that has to be done by October, which is only a couple of months from now, October of this year. And if you look at the number of things that will come forward to either City Council or the Police Board by January, which seems far away, but it's only a few months, I think this will be as sweeping a series of changes and as rapid a process of change as we've probably ever seen. And I include in that even the modernization report that I was a part of in the last term. That took a couple of years of work. And so I think because there have been so many reports written, because the message has been received so loud and clear by elected officials and by members of the police board about the need for change now, you are actually seeing quite a few of these recommendations with quite compressed timetables, and I think that's quite proper. And I certainly, for one, know time is marching on. I know there have been reports written in the past. I know these issues are corrosive, and I know we've received a message loud and clear from the public. I'll be pressing to make sure that deadlines are set and that they're met, because I think that it's important that while we do these things carefully and constructively, that we do them and that we're seen to do them.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it for...
No follow-up.
Oh, thank you, Francine.
Thank you very much.
That's it for today. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.